This has been a long-standing kind of issue, as you know, in our communities, and it's kind of one of those issues that's kind of swept under the rug for such a long period of time, and we either never got to talk about it or never held that it was an important enough time. But it's better that we're talking about it now than it never gets talked about. So when we talk about, racism and prejudice and all of these different concepts, the place where we start from an Islamic framework is really this word that we call Asabiyyah. And Asabiyyah really comes from a word in Arabic that means just to wrap around something and to adhere to something really, really strongly and not let it go. And I'm mentioning this root word because it gives us context in the type of kind of psychological and spiritual thing that this is. This is kind of a condition that's talked about in ethics, in Islamic ethics. I've given a general working definition from the book 40 Hadith about what Asabiyyah is, and it's this inner psychic or psychological quality that's manifested in patronizing a person's kindred, which you have some type of relationship with, or you have some type of affinity with. And what I thought was very interesting about the definition Islamically is that if you look at the end of that definition, it says that it's a moral vice that's an abominable trait or horrible trait that begets many more vices and deviations and things like that. I think that it's really important as our community has these discussions about racism and has these discussions about what happens in our community, just taking a moment to step back and realizing that it's not just, well, there was one racist incident that happened in the masjid and we don't have to worry about it, but understanding just from a spiritual perspective that Asabiyyah is something that everybody has and can have. And it is something that we have to start internally working on. We all have this tendency to, this spiritual tendency to align ourselves with the group, sometimes at the detriment of others. And the interesting thing about these qualities is we tend not to see them, right? I mean, we never look at our own faults, or we never look at ourselves. So that's kind of a working definition of it. Put this hadith up there for people to see, and it's a tradition of the Prophet, peace be upon him, and his family, which says that whoever possesses in his heart Asabiyyah and any of its forms, even to the extent of a mustard seed, God will raise him on the day of resurrections as he would raise the Bedouins of Jahiliyyah. It's something that our communities, our masajid, have to speak about and they have to talk about. And it's something that we just can't kind of dismiss, because it's not just a sin, but it's kind of this seed that breeds all these other sins. And when I read this hadith, one of the interesting things is at first you read it and you have this sense of really, well, gosh, it's not that bad. Why would I be raised on the day of judgment as someone from Jahiliyyah? But we really see this played out today. We see it in our society where racism and these hidden forms of racism, how they kind of just snowball in society and communities, and how it really tears up society. I want to talk a little bit about this concept of fragility. So as you know, there's this term kind of floating around about fragility, and there's a lot of discussion about the book White Fragility, and how does this play into an Islamic context, and is everything she's saying Islamic? And I want to get it kind of away from that, because the basic concept of putting the book aside, the basic concept of what's talked about in fragility, that Asabiyyah really exists in everybody's heart. This basic definition, this working definition of, is this uncomfortable feeling that a person has at discussions of race, And that displays out in a number of ways. It can display out in anger, fear, guilt, arguing, keeping quiet, or just not wanting to have the discussion at all. And, I recall a while back, about maybe 10 years ago, I had given a lecture at a masjid on racism. And at that time, I was kind of really blunt with people about possibly some of the racism that we see in our communities. And I was bringing up some of these examples about how, not just with Black people, but how we see this racism played out, or this Asabiyyah played out with different ethnicities, whether it be Indian Pakistanis, whether it be Iranians, whether it be Arabs, whether it be Afghanis. And at that time, 10 years ago, it made people really, really uncomfortable. And there were a lot of comments that came back. One of the comments were kind of, well, why are we talking about this issue? Why is this issue important to us? There's a whole bunch of more important issues. And it was really interesting because you had a whole group of people there that were, who had experienced racism in the community, that had really come to me for years and told me just horrific stories. And I gave just one speech on racism, and I would say the dominant ethnicity at that particular masjid got really, really upset. Why it's important, as we talk about this in just a Shia context, I pulled this kind of snippet from the book 40 Hadith also because I thought it was really eloquent and beautiful the way the author had put it. And he said, in commenting on that hadith that I just gave, why is it important? He says that, a person who becomes that, and I'm just going to kind of read this here. Such a person is a defender and lover of truth. He will become counted among champions of human sublimity, a rightful citizen of the ideal human society, and wholesome member of society whose presence exerts a reforming influence on the evils of the public. And if one's selfish and tribal instincts arouse him to defend and patronize the vices and wrongs of his kinsmen and associates, he is inflicted with the vice of Asabiyyah. He is a corrupt member of society who corrupts it by confusing vice with virtue and stands with the Bedouins of Jahiliyyah, etc. So I found this really, really eloquent and really to the point. There's this tendency in our community to say, well, we shouldn't talk about race, or we shouldn't recognize this because Islam has said that we shouldn't have racism, so we shouldn't recognize race. And that's interesting. So, if you look at the slide there, one of the interesting things is from a Quranic perspective, we really have that this is actually something that Quran is very kind of clear about, that race is kind of recognized. It's just recognized in this lens of Tawheed. It's not that Allah is saying, okay, there are no races and you just stay colorblind. This idea or notion that, okay, we just have to be colorblind and don't be racist and everything is going to turn out okay. I think it's quite the opposite. What we see from that Quranic paradigm is really that God's telling us, no, this is actually one of his signs, that you're going to see different people with different languages, different accents, and different colors. And for those people who have knowledge, they'll understand that this is something really beautiful. This is a sign of God in society. Where it says, from the time of Adam until our time, we are like the teeth of a comb, and there's no greatness for an Arab over a non-Arab, and no greatness for a red-skinned person over a black-skinned person, except due to one's consciousness, taqwa. What I found very interesting about this is the Prophet chose to mention, he didn't just mention black and white. What existed there was really this hierarchy of some level of privilege and some level in society where there was a difference between how people were treated who were a little bit lighter versus somebody who was less light.
And we've all experienced that. I'm more fair-skinned than the average Khoja, so Indian ancestors who were in East Africa, and have always been complimented on the fairness of my skin. So we can talk more about those stories later, but it's definitely true that if we've all experienced shadeism or colorism to some degree in our own lives. And for those of us who are struggling a little bit with the idea of racism and whether we're playing a role or harboring any racism, starting at a place of colorism should help sort of bridge the rest of that conversation and make it more salient.
The other things is that, it's not always obvious. That's the whole point here. Why are we having this conversation? Because Asabiyyah is not obvious. It's not something, it's not something that we can sometimes clearly see we're doing. It really does sometimes require somebody to kind of point it out to us. And if it never goes pointed out, we just kind of go on in that cycle. The other thing is understanding kind of how there are systems of oppression. And again, we'll talk about this more later, but there are already systems there that we're coming into that are very oppressive. And this really has to do with how history has been laid out, and that's human history, and especially history in America. When we start to study the history in America, going back to the transatlantic slave trade and going back to so many things that have happened in this country, then we start to see how a lot of those systems kind of formed and how we're existing in those systems. And we may be actually non-aware participants in that's happening. But when we look in our masajid and we look in our communities, I see it, and I see it's really interesting because we have it played out in when lighter kids are sometimes given more attention. Even to the extent of a parent, I've seen this, a parent will have a lighter child and a darker child, and people just pay more attention to the lighter child.
Yeah, talk about what that child will be unpacking and as they grow into a young adult. And what biases they will carry and further when they have children. So
it's also the mannerisms, and I came across this very interesting hadith regarding the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and it's this man is in the prayer line, and there's a poor person that comes and sits next to him, and it's funny because we hear this. I've heard this hadith since I was a young child, and we hear this hadith all our life, and so this man comes and he sits next to a man who's rich. And the man who's rich does this, kind of moves over and he kind of frowns just slightly. And the Prophet knows him, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He knows him, and he says to him, why did you do that? Did you think that his poverty would go on you? And it's such a profound hadith because the man didn't say anything. He didn't say, "Oh, I think you're bad," or "I think you're whatever." He just moved. That's all he did. He didn't insult the man. He didn't. And so as we're talking about these things like implicit bias, some of the misconceptions that we have are that, well, I've never said anything racist, or I've never said anything bad to anybody. And sometimes it's not just about that, how we treat people just Islamically even. It's those things we do really unconsciously to other human beings where they feel welcome or they don't feel welcome in our communities.
Can you elaborate a little bit on what leaders of masajid and scholars can do to break down issues like this?
I think from an institutional level, I think it starts from the top and the bottom. It starts from the top, meaning that it has to become an issue in our community, and that has to start from the mimbar, in a very focused way, talking about concrete examples versus talking about just the abstract idea of racism is bad and Islam is beautiful because it's a non-racist religion, but talking about how can that play out in our communities? How can we do more? So scholars and speakers giving very specific examples. That's one. I think that at a bottom level, it starts really in the Sunday schools. I think that if it doesn't start in the Sunday schools, then what we do is we raise children with this idea that this concept of race, and sometimes the problem of race in the larger American society, doesn't exist. You know, which becomes a real problem, because when you have a child who in Sunday school doesn't learn about why race is important, and they live predominantly in a white community all of their lives, these children will go out into their communities, and as we said, if there's a system of racism around them, they're going to pick up those things. So it's good to deconstruct those things from a very young age. I would say, again, at the top, it's important for the lectures, it's important for the scholar, or it's important for the heads of the masjid to make it a point that when people do come to the masjid who are new, greet them, welcome them, notice them, making a concerted effort to look at somebody who has come to the masjid for the first time or a few times, who's a different ethnicity, and really reach out to them. Go to them, sit with them, talk to them, and make sure that they feel welcome or they need anything. This is really kind of what we see from the Imams of Ahlul Bayt, how they, when people were visiting their town, they would do this, right? Go and ask them, hey, do you need anything? So I think that would be a good way to enact this in our communities. There is one point that I think is really missed amongst Muslims, and that's that African American history and Muslim history are one history when we talk about this country of Muslim history. It's not a separate history. African Americans have been here since the inception. If many of them brought here as slaves, and I think that when we talk about we're American, not recognizing that we cannot talk about Muslim history unless we talk about African American history is really important. So I just wanted to say that's something that we should really have in the back of our educational philosophy in Sunday schools or in the masajid, that we can't develop an identity of Muslim Americans without that component to it. It can't be separated.
What can we do to break down barriers and remove the stigma associated with marrying outside of your race or ethnicity?
There's something that can be done from the leaders of the masajid, and the leaders of the masajid, I think, in this ongoing conversation, mentioning how continuously speaking about how this issue of race was something that was actively talked about and worked on by the Prophet and Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam. I think that this is the first critical step, and not talked about in abstract ways. And I don't have time here to talk about those stories, but they're really, really clear stories of just blatant racism, of times people went to the Prophet and literally said, I'm not marrying my daughter to that person because they're black, or they're this, and the Prophet told them, you're wrong. You cannot refuse this person based on that. And we have historical examples of certain of our imams marrying people who were black, and it's I think so that the tarbiyat starts from the culture starts shifting from there at the institutional level. At the other level, I think that this is slowly changing in our community, maybe not as fast as we want, but I think out of necessity now, some of these cultures are marrying into each other, but there's still, I know, a huge stigma with marrying other cultures, and I would say that one of the ways is to begin to open up this uncomfortable conversation. I've talked to members of our community, and this issue has happened in me trying to get people married. People will come to marry somebody, and I'll ask them for all of their requirements, and they'll give me all of their requirements, and I'll go through this this rigorous process of talking to them 2 or 3 times, getting every detail that they could possibly want. And I'd find a perfect match for them until they find out that the girl or the boy is darker than them. And then there's this slew of, reasons why they can't marry that person. Until, when I press them, then they'll just say, well, my parents won't allow me to marry somebody darker or to marry someone black. And I think that elephant in the room just we need to recognize it so we can discuss it, because we're in our community, unfortunately, we're not even at a point to admit that exists. We all know about it. We all know it in some way, but we just don't want to address the topic of, hey, this is there and it's wrong. And we need to call it out.